Let's talk about World War I, the Great War. It was a conflict that completely changed the world, redrew the map of Europe, and introduced us all to the horrors of modern industrial warfare. But how on earth did it all begin? How did one single act of violence in a small corner of the Balkans just explode into a global catastrophe? Okay, let's get into it.
So that's the big question, isn't it? I mean, it sounds almost crazy that the assassination of one guy, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, could be the trigger for a war that would end up killing millions and millions of people. But to really get it, you have to understand what Europe was actually like back then. In the early 20th century, people often described Europe as a powder keg. And that's the perfect description. See, on the surface, it seemed like a time of incredible progress, even peace. But underneath all that, these powerful forces, these massive tensions and rivalries, were just building and building, waiting for one little spark to set the whole thing off. To help make sense of all these underlying tensions, historians have a really handy acronym, MAIN. It stands for militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. Think of these four things as the long, slow-burning fuses leading right to that powder keg. Each one was cranking up the pressure, making a huge conflict more and more likely. So, let's break that down. We're going to unpack each of these causes to see how they created such an unbelievably volatile situation. We'll start with the M in MAIN, which is militarism. Now, militarism wasn't just about having bigger armies. It was about game-changing technology. Take this ship, the British warship HMS Dreadnought. When this thing hit the water in 1906, it changed everything. I mean, with its massive guns and powerful new engines, it was faster and stronger than any battleship that had ever existed. It literally made every other navy in the world obsolete, overnight. So what happens when one country builds a superweapon? Well, everyone else wants one too, right? And that's exactly what happened. The Dreadnought kicked off this absolutely frantic naval arms race, especially between Britain and Germany. Just look at this chart. Year after year, they were desperately trying to outbuild each other. This wasn't just about ships, it was a symbol of national power, and it ratcheted up the suspicion and hostility like you wouldn't believe. Okay, next up is A for alliances. By the early 1900s, Europe had basically split itself into two big armed camps. On one side, you had the Triple Entente, Britain, France, and Russia, and on the other, the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. And here's the really scary part. These alliances were like a continental tripwire. A dispute between just two countries could now drag everyone else into the fight, whether they wanted to be there or not.
All right, let's talk IE, imperialism. The great powers weren't just staring each other down at home. No, they were in a global race, a scramble for dominance all across the world. This fierce competition for colonies in Africa and Asia, for all those resources and new markets, it just created constant friction. It poisoned relationships and fueled this deep-seated rivalry that spilled right back into Europe.
And finally, we have N for nationalism. This quote from a poem that was super popular with British boys back in 1914 really captures the vibe of the time. There was this intense, almost aggressive pride in your own country. This wasn't just patriotism. It was a cultural mood that glorified struggle, that saw war as some kind of noble test. And it also fueled this burning desire for independence among groups like the Serbs, who were stuck inside the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So let's recap. We've got a continent bristling with weapons, tangled up in alliances, fighting over empires, and just gripped by this intense nationalism, a real powder keg. All it needed was a spark. And that spark came on a summer day in the city of Sarajevo.
Now, the guys who lit the fuse, they weren't generals or politicians. They were young, radical students. People like Gavrilo Princip, who was only 19 years old. They were Bosnian Serbs who saw the Austro-Hungarian Empire as an occupying force, and they were dreaming of a unified nation for their people. Armed by a shadowy Serbian nationalist group called the Black Hand, they planned to make a very violent, very public statement. The events of that day were just this incredible mix of careful planning and pure tragic coincidence. The first assassination attempt failed when a bomb just bounced off the Archduke's car. Now, you'd think they would have called it a day, right? But amazingly, the Archduke decided to continue with his tour. And then his driver made a wrong turn. As the car stalled trying to reverse, it stopped just a few feet away from Gavrilo Princip. He stepped forward and fired 2 shots. Those 2 shots triggered what we now call the July Crisis. This was the moment. This is when the long fuse of Maine, militarism, alliances, imperialism, nationalism, finally reached the powder keg. That complex web of alliances ensured that what started as a regional crisis would become a continental inferno. So, Austria-Hungary, with Germany's full support, was determined to punish Serbia. They issued an ultimatum with a list of demands so harsh it was basically impossible to accept. The biggest sticking point was a demand that Austrian officials be allowed to operate inside Serbia. Serbia actually agreed to most of the terms, but they rejected that one, saying it violated their sovereignty as a nation. And that was the excuse Austria-Hungary was waiting for. And then the dominoes just fell with terrifying speed. It was like a chain reaction and fast forward. On July 28th, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. Boom. Russia starts mobilizing to protect Serbia. Boom. Germany sees that as a threat, declares war on Russia. Then, Germany invades neutral Belgium to get to France, which forces Britain to declare war on Germany. Within about a week, all the great powers of Europe were at war. The war that began in August 1914 would be unlike anything anyone had ever seen before. The glorious adventure that so many young men had imagined, well, it very quickly turned into a nightmare of unprecedented brutality. And this right here is maybe one of the most important things to get: the massive gap between expectations and reality. Everyone thought it'd be a quick war of heroic battles. Soldiers literally marched off believing they would be home by Christmas. The reality? 4 long years of grinding trench warfare. It was industrial slaughter, with new weapons like the machine gun creating a bloody stalemate that nobody knew how to break. And that's why it was so different. As the historian David Zabecki says, World War I was a massive revolution in warfare. Almost everything about how you fought a battle in 1914 was completely obsolete by 1918. This conflict basically forged the blueprint for modern war, but it came at the cost of millions and millions of lives. And that brings us to our final thought. This conflict was so devastating that people at the time called it the war to end all wars. They genuinely hoped that humanity would never, ever do something like this again. But it wasn't, was it? The very peace treaty that ended the fighting actually sowed the seeds for an even deadlier war just 2 decades later. So why wasn't it the end? Well, that's a question that shows just how deep the roots of this conflict truly ran.